Vienna's December was especially cold. A gray sky hung low over the old buildings, and a few snowflakes lazily floated in the freezing air. In the large living room of the Hoffmann mansion, the fireplace crackled warmly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, which were covered with photos from music concerts and diplomas from prestigious competitions. Friedrich Hoffmann stood by the window, looking out at the empty street. He was a tall, well-built man with noble gray at his temples and deep wrinkles between his eyebrows. His fingers, once used to holding a conductor's baton, now nervously tapped on the windowsill, beating the rhythm of an imaginary melody. Behind him, sitting in a wheelchair, was a boy, thin, pale, with lifeless eyes staring at something far beyond the wall. His hands lay still on his lap, hands that once moved across the piano keys with incredible speed, now seemed foreign, lifeless. Friedrich spoke softly to his son, saying that Dr. Lorenz recommended a new round of physical therapy. Max slightly winced and quietly said it would be another pointless disappointment. His father sighed heavily. It had been 8 months since that terrible day when their car crashed on a mountain road. 8 months since his 14-year-old son, a child prodigy, beloved by the Viennese public, the hope of Austria's classical music scene, ended up in a wheelchair. 8 months since the hands that had created so much beautiful music had become useless. Friedrich tried to speak with confidence, even though he hadn't felt it in a long time, talking about the best specialists. But Max interrupted him bitterly. He reminded his father that they had already seen the best doctors in Vienna, Berlin, and Paris, and all had said the same thing: he would never walk or play again. Max asked his father to accept it, just like he had. Something flickered in Friedrich's eyes, but he quickly got control of himself and said that a new doctor would come at 3 o'clock, asking his son to at least talk to him. Max turned away, staring at the wall again. At that moment, Greta came into the room. The housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with neatly combed hair and a stern face. She said there was a visitor who came about a job offer. Friedrich frowned, saying he hadn't posted any job ads, but stopped when a small figure stepped out from behind Greta. It was a girl about 12 years old in a worn coat that didn't fit and worn-out shoes. Her messy chestnut hair was loosely tied back, and her big brown eyes looked straight at them with confidence. In her hands, she held a battered bag. She introduced herself as Eliza Morel, and with a slight French accent, she suddenly said she had come to help Max walk again and play the piano. The room fell silent. Greta snorted, not hiding her scorn for the poor girl. Friedrich blinked in confusion, not knowing how to react to such boldness. And for the first time in a long while, Max showed interest in what was happening, curiously looking at the strange girl. Friedrich began to speak, saying he wanted to know who sent her and how she even knew about their situation. But Eliza calmly answered that she had come on her own. She had seen Max at a concert 2 years ago and now could help him. An outraged Greta was about to call security, but suddenly Max stopped her, saying he wanted to listen to the girl. Friedrich, surprised by his son's reaction, looked closely at him, then at the girl, and slowly nodded, agreeing to hear out the mysterious guest. Eliza spoke quietly but confidently, telling her story. 3 years ago, she had been in an accident. Doctors said she would never walk again, and she spent a whole year in a wheelchair. But then she met a man who helped her remember how to move, how to feel, and she started walking again. When Friedrich asked where this miracle healer was, Eliza simply said he had died a year ago, but he had taught her everything he knew. Friedrich shook his head in disbelief, talking about consultations with the best neurologist in Europe and his son's serious nerve damage. But Eliza firmly replied that nerves could heal, even if very slowly. The most important thing was to believe and not give up. When Greta made a sarcastic remark about magic and fraud, Eliza firmly said she was only offering what had helped her. The girl stood up and took a few steps across the room. Max noticed her slight limp in the left leg. 3 years ago, she couldn't walk at all, and doctors said it was impossible. But now she stood in front of them. Unexpectedly, Max asked his father to give Eliza a chance, arguing that they had nothing left to lose. Friedrich looked closely at his son. Over the past months, he had watched Max slowly fall into apathy, had seen the light in his eyes fade away. But now, as he looked at this strange girl, he noticed, for the first time, a spark of hope in his son's eyes and voice. Reluctantly agreeing, the man made a condition. He would be present at every session and would stop everything at the first sign of any harm. When asked where she came from and where she lived, Eliza said she lived at the St. Mary's shelter on the edge of the city. Her parents had died in the same accident that had injured her. She had walked to the Hoffman house by herself after finding their address in a newspaper interview about what had happened to Max. Wasting no time, Eliza began the first session. She walked over to the grand piano in the corner of the living room, a beautiful instrument that hadn't been opened since the accident. Carefully lifting the lid, she ran her fingers over the keys, not pressing them, just feeling their smooth surface. After getting Friedrich's permission, the girl gently played a simple tune, a few notes that seemed to hang in the air. Max flinched, recognizing the lullaby his mother used to play for him long ago. Surprised that Eliza knew this melody, Max asked where she had learned it. The girl honestly replied that she didn't know. The melody had simply come to her when she touched the keys. That sometimes happened to her. Friedrich frowned. Very few people knew that tune. His late wife had composed it for little Max. At Eliza's request, Max wheeled himself over to the piano, surprising his father by doing it on his own. The girl asked him to place his hands on the keys. On the third try, he managed to do it, but his hands lay lifelessly, unable to press a single note. Eliza placed her small palms gently over his hands and in a soft musical voice, began to speak about how important it was to remember not with your hands but with your heart. The music was still inside him. It hadn't gone anywhere. It was like a river blocked by a dam, and they needed to find a tiny crack in that dam. Friedrich watched what was happening with growing skepticism. But just as he was about to stop what he thought was a silly act, something amazing happened. The index finger on Max's right hand twitched slightly and pressed a key. A single note, middle C, rang out. Max's eyes opened wide. He looked at his hand in disbelief and whispered that he had felt his finger. Eliza smiled and said it was only the beginning. Max's brain had received the signal, and now it needed time to fully understand it. That was enough for today. Friedrich stood frozen, unable to speak. What he had just seen went against everything the doctors had told them. It could have been a coincidence, a muscle spasm. But Max's face, it showed hope, for the first time in many long months. Max asked when Eliza would come again, and she said tomorrow, if they allowed it. Friedrich offered to send a car for her and to pay her, but the girl refused the money, saying she only needed permission to come. When Friedrich, puzzled, asked why it was so important for her to help his son, Eliza, after a long pause, replied that someone had once helped her when everyone else had turned away, and now it was her turn to help others. In the weeks that followed, amazing changes took place in the Hoffmann mansion. Eliza came every day, and with each session, Max made small but steady progress. First, he learned to move the fingers on his right hand, then his left. After 2 weeks, he could already play a simple scale. His fingers still moved clumsily, but the fact that they were moving at all felt like a miracle. Friedrich, who had been skeptical at first, grew more and more amazed by his son's progress. He watched the sessions, sometimes asking questions, but most often sitting quietly, deep in thought. Eliza worked with Max not just as a therapist. She talked to him, told stories, sometimes even joked, making the boy smile. That was another small miracle, seeing a smile on a face that for months had shown only pain and emptiness. One day, while watching Eliza show Max a finger exercise, Friedrich noticed something strange in her movements. Something about the way she tilted her head, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. It reminded him of something vague, a faint memory he couldn't fully grasp. That evening, when Eliza was getting ready to leave, Friedrich asked her about her parents. Eliza answered reluctantly, saying she hardly remembered them. The accident happened when she was 9. They had been driving to the mountains. Her father was a musician, though she didn't remember what kind. Her mother loved classical music. Friedrich frowned. In their music world, there had been many people lost in car crashes, especially on the mountain roads leading to popular resorts. He wanted to ask something else, but Eliza had already said goodbye and left. Little by little, the sessions began to bring results not only in Max's hands, but also in his legs. One day during an especially intense session, while Eliza was playing the piano and Max listened with his eyes closed, his right leg suddenly twitched to the rhythm of the music. It was an involuntary reflex, but Eliza noticed it and stopped playing. "Did you feel that?" she asked, pointing to his leg. Max looked down in surprise but said nothing. He hadn't felt anything at all. But Eliza insisted, "Your body remembers music. It moved on its own, without a command from your brain. That means the connection is still there." From that day on, they started working not only on his hands, but also on his legs. The progress was slow, almost invisible, but Eliza didn't give up. She brought strange objects, smooth stones, rough feathers, pieces of silk, and made Max touch them with his hands first, then gently press them against his legs, always talking about how important it was to wake up the body's memory. Friedrich, watching these sessions, often thought of his late wife, Eliza. She had also believed in alternative methods, in the power of nature, in the energy of music. Long ago, he used to laugh at it, but now seeing how his son was slowly, yet surely, coming back to life, he began to wonder if maybe she had been right all along. 2 months passed. Max was already able to play simple pieces, though his playing was still far from the brilliance it once had. His legs began reacting to touch. He still couldn't move them, but he could now feel when something touched them, which had been impossible before. Dr. Lorenz, who had been observing him for all these months, was amazed. He couldn't explain the progress from a medical point of view and insisted on running new tests. Friedrich agreed, and the results shocked everyone. The nerve endings, once thought to be completely destroyed, had somehow started to regenerate. It was a medical anomaly, almost impossible by modern scientific standards. "How do we explain this?" Lorenz asked Friedrich, looking at the scans. Friedrich had no answer, but he thought of the little girl with the piercing eyes who walked every day from the orphanage, refused money, and patiently, tirelessly worked with his son. One evening, after an especially successful session, Friedrich decided to drive Eliza to the shelter himself, despite her protests. He wanted to speak with the director personally, maybe help the shelter financially, as a way to thank them for raising such an amazing girl. St. Mary's Shelter turned out to be a gloomy stone building. Tall walls, small windows, heavy gates. It looked more like a prison than a home for children. Friedrich felt a chill as he passed through the gates. Eliza walked beside him, visibly tense. The director, Madame Klein, met them in her office. A strict woman with thin lips and a cold gaze. She listened to Friedrich's enthusiastic story about how Eliza was helping his son, with clear skepticism. "Eliza has always been an unusual child," she said when Friedrich finished. "After the accident, she spent almost a year in bed. The doctors said she would never walk again. Then this strange old man appeared, Theodore. He came every day, spent hours with her, talked to her, played an old violin. We thought he was a bit odd, but we allowed the visits. Who could they harm?" And suddenly, Eliza began to walk, first with crutches, then with a cane, and a year later, on her own. The doctors were amazed, but they couldn't explain the phenomenon. Friedrich listened, a chill running down his spine. The story sounded unbelievable, but he had seen the results with his own eyes. Eliza really could walk, even if with a slight limp. "Who was this Theodore?" he asked. "How did he find out about Eliza?" Madame Klein shrugged. "No one knows. He just showed up one day and said he wanted to help. He said he had once been a musician, but his career didn't work out. He died a year ago. Heart attack. Since then, Eliza has changed. She became more determined. She said she had inherited his gift and now had to help others." As they were leaving the office, Friedrich noticed an old photo in a frame hanging on the wall. He stopped, drawn to it. In the photo, a group of children stood in front of the shelter. In the corner stood an elderly man with a long white beard, holding a violin. His face looked vaguely familiar to Friedrich. "Is that Theodore?" he asked, pointing to the man. Madame Klein nodded. "Yes, that's him. Taken about a month before he passed away." Friedrich stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to remember where he had seen that face before. Then suddenly it hit him. Many years ago, back when he was still a student at the conservatory, there had been a professor named Theodore Meyer. a brilliant violinist, full of promise, who had suddenly disappeared from the stage due to a strange illness that affected his hands. People said he could no longer play, that his muscles had stopped obeying him. Could it really be him? On the way home, Friedrich was silent. Eliza sat beside him, looking out the car window. Finally, he asked, "This Theodore, did he ever talk about his past? About who he was before he started helping you?" Eliza turned to him. "He said he was once a famous musician, but lost everything because of an illness. The doctors couldn't help him, and he found a way to heal on his own. But it was too late for his career. Too much time had passed, the world had forgotten him, so he decided to help others, especially children." Friedrich nodded. That matched the story of Theodore Meyer. But how had he ended up at that shelter? And why Eliza? As they pulled up to the mansion, Max came out of the front door. It was so unexpected that Friedrich froze in place. His son wasn't just sitting in a wheelchair. He was standing, leaning on a cane, and taking unsteady steps. "Dad, Eliza, look!" Max was slowly, with great effort, moving his legs, leaning on the cane. His face was twisted with strain, but his eyes shone with triumph. Eliza jumped out of the car and ran to him. "You did it! I knew you could!" she cried, clapping her hands in joy. Friedrich couldn't move. Tears streamed down his cheeks. It was a miracle, a real miracle he was witnessing with his own eyes. His son, whom the best doctors in Europe had condemned to a life in a wheelchair, was taking steps. Shaky, trembling, but his own steps. "When? How?" was all he could manage to say as he finally walked over to his son. "After you left," Max answered, still smiling. "I was sitting at the piano, thinking about what Eliza said about body memory, and suddenly I felt a tingling in my legs. I couldn't believe it. I called Greta, she helped me stand, gave me a cane, and I walked, Dad, I really walked." That night, no one in the Hoffmann house could sleep. Friedrich sat by his son's bed, listening to Max's excited story about how he had felt his legs for the first time. Max talked about the future, about returning to the stage, about new concerts, all the things that had seemed impossible not long ago. For the first time in many months, Friedrich allowed himself to hope. But with that hope came questions. Who was Eliza? Where did she get these abilities? And why did Theodore Meyer, if it really was him, choose her to pass on his strange gift? The next morning, Friedrich decided to start his own investigation. He called an old friend, a music historian, and asked him about Theodore Meyer. The friend confirmed. The famous violinist had indeed disappeared from the stage more than 30 years ago due to a mysterious illness in his hands. People believed he had died in obscurity many years ago. But there was another interesting detail, the friend added. Meyer had a student, a young pianist named Sofia Valentini. Very talented, she could have had a great career, but she gave up music and vanished around the same time as Meyer. People said they had a romantic relationship, but that's just a rumor. Friedrich thanked his friend and hung up. Sofia Valentini. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't remember where he'd heard it. Maybe he needed to speak to Eliza more openly, ask her directly about her past, about her parents. But that day, Eliza didn't come, nor the next day or the one after. Max grew more and more anxious, asking where she was, why she wasn't coming. Friedrich called the shelter, but Madame Klein gave him strange news. Eliza had disappeared. She hadn't returned to the shelter after her visit to the Hoffmanns. Friedrich was deeply worried. What had happened to the girl? Where could she have gone? And why now, just as Max had begun to walk? He went to the police, but they didn't show much interest in a missing orphan. Madame Klein hinted that maybe Eliza had just run away. It had happened before with children her age. But Friedrich didn't believe that. Eliza didn't seem like a child who would run away. She was too responsible, too caring. Something had happened. Something serious. Days passed. Max continued practicing on his own, using the techniques Eliza had taught him. He kept improving. He could already walk around the room without a cane and was playing more complex pieces. But there was worry in his eyes. He missed Eliza. He was worried about her. One evening, Friedrich sat in his study, flipping through old photo albums. He was searching for any mention of Theodore Meyer, hoping to find some kind of clue. And then, as he turned the yellowed pages of a 1990 issue of Musical Vienna magazine, he saw a photo that took his breath away. In the picture was a young woman with chestnut hair and large brown eyes, exactly like Eliza's. The caption read, "Sophia Valentini, rising piano star, student of Theodore Meyer at the Chopin competition." Friedrich stared at the photograph, unable to believe his eyes. The resemblance was striking. The same facial features, the same gaze. Sophia had to be Eliza's mother. But how was she connected to him, to his family? And then a terrible realization struck him. He rushed to the drawer where he kept the documents from the car crash that had taken his wife Annalise's life. With trembling hands, he flipped through the police report until he found what he was looking for. The list of vehicles involved in the accident. There had been 3, the Hoffmanns' car, a truck that had lost control, and a small Fiat driven by Sophia Valentini. There was also a child in the car, a 9-year-old girl whose name was not listed in the report. Friedrich sank into his chair, feeling the ground fall away beneath him. That's why Eliza knew Annalise's lullaby. That's why she was so determined to help Max. In the same accident that killed his wife, little Eliza had been injured, and her mother, Sophia Valentini, had died. But why was Sophia on that road at the same time? Who was she bringing in the car? And why had Eliza, knowing all this, never told him the truth? The next morning, Friedrich decided to return to St. Mary's Shelter, hoping to find any information about Eliza's past. Madame Klein let him in reluctantly, still annoyed by the girl's disappearance. In her office, Friedrich asked directly if she knew anything about Eliza's parents, especially her mother, Sophia Valentini. Madame Klein looked at him with surprise, then walked to a cabinet and took out a thin folder. "This is her file," she said. "Normally we don't show these documents to outsiders, but given the circumstances and your particular interest, I'll make an exception." There weren't many documents inside. Medical records, school reports, a few photographs. The last item was a birth certificate. Friedrich took it with trembling hands and read, "Eliza Sophia Valentini. Date of birth, March 12th, 2001. Mother, Sophia Valentini. Father," and there was his name, Friedrich Hoffmann. The world stopped. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Eliza, his daughter? But how was that possible? He had never been with Sophia Valentini. He didn't even remember meeting her. Madame Klein, observing his reaction, said dryly, "I take it this is news to you." Friedrich couldn't speak. He stared at the document, unable to believe what he was seeing. "When Eliza was brought to us after the accident," Madame Klein continued, "she had a box with her. Sophia left it for her daughter. We had planned to give it to Eliza when she turned 18, but given the circumstances, perhaps you should take a look." She left the room and returned with a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. On the lid were 2 engraved letters, S and F, Sophia and Friedrich. With a pounding heart, Friedrich opened the box. Inside were several letters, some photographs, and a small music box. He took the top letter, written in elegant handwriting. "My dear Eliza, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer with you. I wanted so much to tell you this story myself, but fate decided otherwise. You must know the truth about where you come from. Your father is Friedrich Hoffmann, a famous conductor and pianist. We loved each other many years ago, when I was a student of his teacher, Theodore Meyer. It was a deep, powerful love, but it had to remain a secret. Friedrich was married, and I was too young. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't tell him. I didn't want to ruin his family, his career. I left, changed my name, and started a new life. But I always followed his successes from afar. Now, as my life nears its end, I've decided that you must know your father. We are going to Vienna to meet him. I don't know how he will react, but I am sure that he will love you as much as I do. Remember, no matter what happens, you are an extraordinary girl with a remarkable gift. Use it to make the world a better place, as Theodore taught you. With endless love, your mother." Or the letter slipped from Friedrich's hands. Memories flooded him like a tidal wave. Sophia Valentini. Now he remembered. a young, talented pianist with whom he'd had a brief but passionate affair during a summer music festival in Italy, at a time when his marriage with Annalise was going through a serious crisis. When the festival ended, Sophia had suddenly disappeared, leaving no address, no phone number. He had searched for her for several months, but eventually gave up, deciding it had just been a passing romance for her. He went back to Annalise, saved their marriage, and with time nearly forgot about Sophia. And all those years he had a daughter he hadn't even known existed, a daughter who had come to him on her own to save his son, her half-brother. "Where could she be?" Friedrich asked, lifting his eyes to Madame Klein. "Where is Eliza?" "I don't know," she answered, "but there was one person she visited often, an old violinist who lived near the cemetery. She called him Maestro." Friedrich went there immediately. The small cabin on the edge of town, right by the cemetery wall, looked almost abandoned. But when he knocked, the door opened, and on the threshold stood an ancient man with a long white beard and deep-set eyes. "Theodore?" Friedrich whispered in disbelief. The old man nodded. "It's been a long time, Friedrich. Come in." Inside, the cabin was modest but clean. In the corner stood an old violin, and on the walls hung photographs. A young Theodore Meyer with an orchestra, with students, with Sophia Valentini. "I thought you were dead," Friedrich said, still stunned to see his former mentor. "To the music world, yes," Theodore replied, pouring tea into 2 worn cups. "When the illness struck my hands, I lost everything. My career, my reputation, my future. The doctors said it was irreversible, but I found another way. A path modern medicine does not accept. I learned to listen to my body, to understand its language, to restore damaged connections between brain and muscle. But it was too late for me to return to the stage, so I chose to help others, those facing the same kind of battle." "Eliza," Friedrich began. "Yes, Eliza," Theodore nodded. "An extraordinary child. When I found out she existed, Sophia told me shortly before her death. I went to the shelter and found her. She was in terrible condition after the accident. The doctors gave her no chance. I began working with her, using my methods, and she responded like no one else ever had. She has a gift, Friedrich, a gift science can't explain." "Where is she now?" Friedrich asked. "Why did she disappear?" Theodore sighed. "She found out the truth, about you, about where she came from. Sophia left her a letter that she was supposed to read when she turned 18. But Eliza found it early and read it. She learned that you are her father, that Max is her brother. She was shocked, confused, scared of how you might react. She came to me." "And where is she now?" Friedrich repeated, feeling his heart tighten with worry. "Here," came a quiet voice from another room. In the doorway stood Eliza, pale, her eyes red from crying. Friedrich stepped toward her but stopped, not knowing what to say, what to do. "Forgive me," he finally said. "Forgive me for not knowing about you, for not looking for you all these years." "It's not your fault," Eliza answered softly. "Mom never told you about me. She wanted to, but then the accident happened." "The accident?" Friedrich shook his head. "The one that took Annalise's life and injured Max. And took my mother," Eliza finished. "Strange, isn't it? In one accident, I lost my mother and found my father and brother." Friedrich couldn't hold back anymore. He stepped forward and embraced Eliza. At first she tensed, but then she melted into his arms, and he felt her tears run down her cheeks. "You don't have to be afraid," he whispered. "You're my daughter, and I'll never leave you again." 6 months had passed. The Hoffmann mansion had changed beyond recognition. Now it was filled with children's laughter, music, and voices. Eliza had moved in with her father and brother, and her presence seemed to bring the house back to life. Max had fully recovered. He not only walked on his own, but had returned to the stage. His first concert after his recovery became a sensation in Vienna's music world. Critics wrote of a miraculous rebirth of the child prodigy, of a new depth in his performance. But no one knew the real story behind this miracle, the story of a little girl with an extraordinary gift. Theodore Meyer had also moved into the Hoffmann mansion, occupying a small room in the attic. Every day he worked with Eliza and Max, passing on his knowledge. Together, they founded a small school for children with physical challenges where they used Theodore's unique method, a blend of music, physical exercises, and deep psychological work. Friedrich watched his children blossom, feeling deep gratitude to fate for this second chance. He often thought about Sophia, about what she must have felt all those years raising his daughter alone, and about what she had wanted to do before her death, to introduce Eliza to her father. On the day Eliza turned 13, they held a big celebration in the garden. Guests, teachers, friends, students from their school, gathered under the large old oak tree. At the center stood a grand concert piano, specially moved outside from the house. As the sun began to set, Max and Eliza sat down at the instrument together. Their fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of a duet they had composed together began to flow. A melody that intertwined themes from Annalise's lullaby and a tune Sophia often sang to little Eliza. Friedrich listened, feeling goosebumps rise on his skin. That music held everything: the pain of loss, the joy of reunion, hope and faith in the future. Two children who had endured so much, who had found each other against all odds, now created a new harmony. Theodore stood nearby, leaning on his cane, his eyes glistening with tears. "You created a miracle," Friedrich said softly. "No," the old violinist shook his head. "They created the miracle. I only showed them the way." When the final notes faded into the air, silence fell. Then came the applause. Loud, heartfelt, filled with admiration and love. Eliza and Max stood up, bowed and embraced each other. Brother and sister, bound not just by blood, but by a shared path. From pain to healing, from suffering to joy. Friedrich watched them, his heart overflowing with pride and gratitude. Fate had taken his wife from him, but had given him a daughter he never knew existed. It had nearly taken his son, and yet brought him back to life through the hands of that very daughter. That evening, after the guests had left and Max and Eliza were asleep, Friedrich sat in his study for a long time, looking at the photographs. Annalisa, Sophia, his children, the strange, tangled story of their lives, which, despite all the tragedies, had led to this moment of peace and harmony. He quietly approached the piano that once belonged to Annalisa and gently touched the keys. Friedrich hadn't played in many years, having devoted himself to conducting, but now his fingers remembered the old motions, found the right notes. He played a simple melody, the very lullaby Annalise had composed for Max, the same one Eliza had played on the day they first met. And in that simple melody, echoing through the silence of the night, was a whole story. A story of loss and rediscovery, pain and healing. A story about the healing hands of a little girl who wasn't afraid to believe in a miracle, even when everyone else had given up.